So welcome to Raisina at Canberra. I'm Rory Medcalf, the head of the National Security College at the Australian National University, and it's a real pleasure for me to host remotely this part of the really important Raisina Dialogue with a distinct regional perspective. And although I'm convening this session from Canberra, the star attraction is, of course, our special guest, our guest speaker, a distinguished guest, the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Singapore, Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan. Welcome very much to the dialogue, Dr. Balakrishnan. So a word or two about our distinguished guest. Dr. Balakrishnan is well known across the region, not only as the Foreign Minister of Singapore and indeed the Minister in charge of the Smart Nation Initiative for Singapore, but having previously served in a number of key portfolios across the Singaporean government and being a Member of Parliament for, I think, 20 years now. Interestingly, during this time of pandemic and health challenge, he also comes to this role, to these political challenges, from a medical background, which I think equips him particularly to speak to the issues that we have in hand today. And I would note that, of course, before entering the political arena, he was in fact not only initially a student of medicine from the National University of Singapore, but ultimately a specialist in ophthalmology. Admitted as a fellow to the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh in 1991. Look, welcome to the dialogue, Dr. Balakrishnan. I might open with a few questions, if I may, about the challenge of the day, the challenge of the pandemic situation. Look, what I might go to first, Minister, if you don't mind, is to ask how the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, is affecting not only public health, but really the economics of your country and of the region. How has the pandemic affected attitudes, particularly towards supply chains and economic resilience in our region?
Thank you, Rory, for that very kind introduction, and also for that opening question, which I think sets the stage for our discussion. Let me begin by thanking the Observer Research Foundation, as well as my good, and I was going to say old friend, Foreign Minister Jai Shankar, for this invitation to the Raisina Dialogue. My starting proposition today is that COVID-19 has not changed history, but it has accelerated. It has accentuated the pre-existing trends, all of which were there before, all of which have significant implications on Singapore, on India, on Australia, and indeed globally. First point, COVID-19 has turbocharged protectionism and nationalism all over the world. The outbreak of COVID-19 and the imposition of lockdowns significantly disrupted trade flows, disrupted supply chains. It sharpened the tendency for policymakers to turn inwards. And this, in a sense, was a political inevitability. It has underscored the importance of upholding open and connected supply chains, free trade, and what we call a multilateral rules-based world order. And it was in this context, particularly for a tiny city-state like Singapore, whose GDP is whose trade volume is 3 times our GDP. It is in this context that we worked with partners like Australia, New Zealand, obviously our partners in Asean, as well as other friends in the Latin American countries in the early days of the pandemic to maintain these open and connected supply chains. So this was a necessity. It's not just a debating point. We also spoke up early about the importance of vaccine multilateralism. My Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, in fact, was the first to use this term and to make the point that fair and equitable access to vaccines is absolutely essential. That's why we were an early supporter of the COVAX facility, which seeks to harmonize public and private incentives for global vaccine developments, and also contributed to the COVAX Advanced Market Commitment to support low-income and lower middle-income countries who need access to vaccines. We also founded and co-chaired the Friends of the COVAX Facility Group together with Switzerland in order to help provide impetus and support for the facility's development. My second point is that COVID-19 has sped up the adoption of technologies, especially digital technologies, for managing the pandemic. And we saw this in almost all aspects of our life, from work, school, transport, transactions, you name it, we have it. This increased dependence on technology will accelerate the already ongoing disruption brought about by the fourth industrial revolution and its impact on jobs and lives and livelihoods. For example, the threat of automation to low-skilled occupations has now broadened significantly to other sectors, including the demand for physical contact and labor decreases in our socially distanced world. At the same time, technology and digitalization will be crucial as we seek to establish a post-COVID-19 normal. In Singapore, we launched a digital contact tracing program. We call it Trace Together, which was based on Bluetooth proximity data and which has succeeded in cutting the average contact tracing time by 2.5 down to about 1.5 days or so. It used to take us 4 days to establish that social graph for every person who was infected with COVID-19. This has made a difference to our ability to constrain the impact of the pandemic in Singapore. In India, we heard of the Arogya Satu app, which has a very similar function. To revive travel, there are efforts currently underway to develop mutual recognition of health certificates and to ensure that there is interoperability and verification across borders and across systems. Singapore has also developed a globally interoperable health cert digital standard. This is based on blockchain technology for COVID-19 test results and vaccine certificates. But actually, at a broader level, beyond the technology, this actually underscores the need to establish common rules and common standards in order to facilitate cross-border digital transactions. And this will also extend to areas such as e-payment and data flows. And this is why Singapore has taken the effort to conclude digital economy agreements with Australia, with Chile, and with New Zealand. And we're actively exploring more such agreements with other partners. I'm also glad that the WTO is also working to create new rules to govern the global digital economy. Third point, COVID-19 has heightened, has sharpened the tensions within the US-China relationship. And this has got implications on all of us. The fundamental shift in US-China relations actually preceded the outbreak of COVID-19. But the friction over trade, the contest over emerging technologies, divergence on human rights, issues related to defense, finance, cybersecurity have continued. We have also witnessed increasingly sharp exchanges between senior figures on both sides, including over the handling of the pandemic. All these are deeply worrying. The US-China relationship is the linchpin for both regional and global stability and is an imperative for global recovery and growth, and needless to say, global peace. Obviously, we all hope that the major powers can exercise leadership in order to underpin a stable international order. In Southeast Asia, it will be all the more crucial to maintain ASEAN unity and centrality amidst this greater geopolitical competition. And even as we deal with our own internal challenges, sharpened by COVID-19. If ASEAN member states can hold together, maintain ASEAN centrality, maintain our relevance, then the long-term prospects for our region are very good. We have 650 million people. We have a growing middle class. We have a fast-growing digital economy. ASEAN member states will press on with economic integration, with the ASEAN community blueprints, and we will continue to expand cooperation within ASEAN and with our external partners as well. All this, we hope, will reinforce the concentric circles of an open and inclusive regional architecture, which includes mechanisms like the East Asia Summit and the ASEAN Regional Forum. In this context, India has a crucial role to play amidst all these trends and in helping to shape the post-COVID-19 world. I'm aware that there is a surge in cases, which continues to pose an immense challenge worldwide, including in India. But we hope that this will not slow down the momentum of global cooperation. India has in fact been one of the strongest supporters of global vaccine cooperation. India's strong pharmaceutical sector has quickly risen to the challenge of vaccine manufacturing. It has supplied more than 64.5 million doses to over 80 countries, including 18 million doses provided through the COVAX facility. In the digital economy and beyond, Indian companies have tremendous growth potential and have an important role to play in stimulating global recovery. With its wealth of engineering talent and a robust digital infrastructure, India's digital and innovation space has thrived and is really ready for liftoff. I am happy to note that India is doing more to encourage foreign investments. This will create more jobs. It will boost India's target of a $5 trillion economy by 2025. So I do hope, and here I'm making a plea, I hope that India will reassess regional trade pacts like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership and even the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. These trade pacts will give Indian companies a platform to showcase their strengths and access even larger markets. Indian conglomerates like Tata, Reliance, Bharti, Adani, TVS, Zomato, DLF, and Forbes Marshall are already globally competitive. And we believe that India can make major contributions to regional affairs, helping to keep the regional architecture open, inclusive, and competitive. ASEAN-India relations have also been enhanced in recent years under Prime Minister Modi's Act East policy and by his administration's support for ASEAN centrality. India has also supported ASEAN's recovery efforts, including by contributing US $1 million to the ASEAN Response Fund. So there are certainly good prospects for greater cooperation. In August this year, Singapore will commence our term as the coordinator of ASEAN-India dialogue relations. And I believe it will be an important opportunity to further deepen and strengthen the ASEAN-India partnership. India's contributions to regional peace, to stability and prosperity will be welcome as we push against the tide of protectionism, economic disruption, and renewed major power competition. So let me pause here and look forward to a dialogue with Rory. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Minister, thank you for that very comprehensive and insightful overview as well, ranging not only from pandemic response, and I believe that the competence with which Singapore has been handling the pandemic, but also the ranging across the economic and strategic challenges in the region. I appreciate your note of confidence despite the difficult situation that the region is in, and acknowledge and echo also your remarks about India's role, India's provision of public goods through its vaccine program in particular. Minister, with your permission, I want to ask you a few questions that will perhaps elaborate on what you've also said, but also, I guess, gently challenge a few of those observations, try to tease you out a little bit more for this audience. I think when Singapore speaks to issues of regional and global significance, it does have a very attentive audience. Firstly, I'd ask you a little bit more about the economic challenge, and I think we began with this note, but I'd love to go a little bit further about attitudes towards supply chains in the Indo-Pacific, questions about economic diversification as one of the pathways to resilience. And if you accept some of the logic of that argument, how is ASEAN, as a hub of global trade, prepared to deal with the new pandemic and post-pandemic economic challenges and economic realities?
Well, that's a very salient point. If you think about the pandemic, and especially if you cast your mind back a year ago, one of the key measures that almost all countries needed to embark on was some form of border closure, some form of friction at airports, ports, tourism, and all those. And that was a health-related measure, but there was an immediate knock-on measure. What does this mean for transit of people, transit of goods, supply chains? And I would say one key fact which immediately popped up on the policymakers' radar screen is that pre-COVID, it was about managing inventories just in time. You wanted it to be efficient. You wanted to have as low an inventory as possible. You were trying to eke out marginal profit margins. I think COVID-19 suddenly reminded everyone, just in case. And there was therefore an immediate realization that you actually want to have resilience in your system. And in particular, economic resilience, and therefore the other essential pillar called supply chain resilience. Now, if you stop to think about it, there are three ways to achieve resilience for essential goods. One is that you've stockpiled it before. In the case of a new pandemic, I think quite frankly, it illustrated the world had not adequately prepared, had not adequate stockpiles of essential medications, drugs, vaccines, the rest of it. I mean, part of the problem, obviously, it hadn't been developed yet. That's one. Beyond stockpiling, the other method is onshoring. And I think you saw that to some extent, but onshoring is something which you can't just switch on instantly. It takes time to bring the capacity to invest in infrastructure to do that. And then the third strategy is diversification, which means you don't have all your eggs literally in one basket. So I think you saw a combination of these three responses in different places, different emphasis on these different modalities. But what you saw was that clearly happening. Now, in the case of Singapore, because we are so small and we're just a city-state, and as I said, our trade volume is 3 times our GDP, closure, absolute closure was not an option. So we wanted to remain open for transit passengers, which we did. We wanted to make sure supply chains of essential goods, food, drugs, medications, all those things continue to flow. And in fact, we felt it would be a source of competitive advantage if throughout this 1 year, now it's almost 1.5 years, we would be able to show that Singapore was trustworthy, reliable, we never shut down, we never panicked, and we fully complied and honored the sanctity of contracts. So this became, in a sense, a competitive strength. But the other point then, and here's where it relates to Australia, New Zealand, Chile, and to India, keeping our network of relations functional and open gives us greater stability in numbers. We were rafting our economies and our supply chains together. So all in all, I would say the challenges were expected. The responses were constrained, but I think we did the best that we could. And I'm reasonably confident that we can emerge stronger. The habits, the agreements, the processes and the experiences that we have all experienced, I think will give us greater confidence for post-COVID world.
Thank you, Minister. I think one of the challenges, of course, is getting there is sufficient vaccine coverage, if you like. I mean, some countries are clearly doing better than others at the moment. And although I think you said some positive things about the development of vaccine multilateralism and the contribution that your country's made to that, the fact is there is a high degree of competition globally at the moment in the vaccine space as well. That's what appears to be the case. And this is a challenge to that multilateralism. So I wonder what you see as the way forward here. Vaccine nationalism on the one hand, vaccine multilateralism on the other. What scope is there to work through existing architecture, existing groupings, or is there a need for some other approach?
Well, let me put this in context. If you had asked me a year ago, would we have, within 1 year, effective vaccines being manufactured and distributed worldwide, I would not have believed you. So the first point is, what you have just witnessed is an incredible pace of vaccine development on multiple platforms in different countries, occurring at unprecedented speed. And we should give everyone, the scientists, the healthcare, the policymakers, the infrastructure, the companies, credit for that. This has been absolutely incredible. First point. The second point, and if you look in terms of the major vaccine manufacturers, the sites of production, obviously the US, the EU, and then it's India and China. If you just look at India itself, for instance, right? I believe I mentioned earlier, India has exported about 64.5 million doses of vaccines. It has administered another 95 million doses domestically within its own borders. If you look at China, I think the figures is that China has exported about 114 million doses, and it has administered domestically about the same level, the same number of cases. So the point here is that, in fact, there has been remarkable production and distribution, even as we speak. And again, the numbers speak for themselves. Now, having said that, we cannot ignore politics and domestic pressures that leaders are going to be confronted by. Meaning, if the domestic level of pandemic control is not there, and there's panic and there's anxiety, there will inevitably be pressure on political leaders to shift the balance point between manufacturing for domestic consumption and export. So I think the point about vaccine multilateralism, which really is an expression of a deeper underlying belief that we are not going to get over this pandemic until everyone is safe. That's still valid, but we need to look into, accept that in context, it is completely unrealistic to expect a major manufacturing site to say, well, I'm going to just export it all and not pay any attention to my domestic circumstances. So I'm just trying to look at things in context and to be fair and to recognize what's really going on. But the big picture view is that this is an unprecedented speed of development and, in fact, remarkable pace of distribution that I would not have dared to anticipate a year ago.
Minister, I will hold you in that space for a moment and stay with the response to the pandemic, and then I would like to move on a little to some of the other challenges the region is facing. But just as an aside to that, I think important point you've made about the, at one level, the success or the, if you like, the scientific miracle of what humanity has achieved with the vaccine response and in response to the pandemic. I'd also put the question to you, about your reflections on the role of expertise in guiding policy, because in many ways we've seen a time recently where I guess some governments have made policy based on scientific medical expertise, some arguably haven't and have at times paid the consequences. Your own background, of course, not only your medical background, but of course, I think you as CEO of the Singapore General Hospital, commanding the Singapore Armed Forces Combat Support Hospital. You've had expertise that you've brought to the role, but perhaps some governments haven't integrated expertise with politics quite as effectively. Can you make a general observation on whether we're seeing actually a return of expertise to guide policy making thanks to the crisis?
Well, I think this has been an acute stress test. First, of healthcare infrastructure within each country. Hospital beds, ICUs, ventilators, drugs, vaccines, etc. Second, government competence, the ability to marshal all resources and make decisions on the basis of data and evidence, scientific data, and to be able to explain and communicate and convince the people to do so. That's been the second aspect of the stress test. And the third aspect of the stress test is really social capital within each of our societies, meaning people's sense of collective responsibility for each other, whether to wear a mask, not really for my sake, but for your sake, whether to comply with social distancing measures. We've got laws and regulations, but really a lot of it depends on your own self-understanding, appreciation, and collective responsibility. So on these three counts, quite frankly, you are witnessing diverging trajectories based on the level of healthcare infrastructure, the level of government overall competence and that ability, as you said, to meld scientific and health rationale and data into policies, and a measure of social capital within each society. On the basis of these three things, you are watching divergence in trajectories. That's how I see this unfolding.
And I guess we all want to be on the right side of that, of that divergence.
We do. And I know it's still, look, right now we're facing either second, third, or fourth waves, depending on how you count it, all over the world. And the other element that's happening is I think there's fatigue. People are tired. People are losing patience. And sometimes even credibility of experts is being questioned. And this, in fact, leads to a more dangerous situation because, and let me give you a perspective from a medical side of it. The virus is evolving and mutating, and the number of new variants generated is directly proportional to the number of people infected at any given moment in time. When you have widespread infection all over the world, what it means is you're going to get more variants developing. And as we have witnessed, some of these variants may be more contagious or more lethal or more resistant, even perhaps to some of the vaccines which we are using. So there is a race going on right now between trying to bring down the overall level of infection in humanity and the measures that we're rolling out, which actually are things like vaccination and all the non-pharmaceutical interventions, which are, by the way, centuries old. Social distancing, testing, isolation, mask wearing. There's no high tech there. It's just about explaining it, persuading people to do it, and executing it. So we are right now in that phase. My own anxiety is that we may have missed the boat, and this virus is now endemic in humanity, and we're going to be continuing to struggle over the next couple of years with dealing with these new variants. So it means, unlike SARS, which I experienced 17, 18 years ago, which disappeared, fortunately, because it wasn't as infectious as COVID-19, and we were able to damp down the reproduction number. We are in a different situation with COVID-19. So I would end on that note of caution that it's not over yet by a long way.
Look, thank you for that. For that important reality check. Before we wrap up the conversation, I do want to ask you one brief question about the other issues. It's not as if the strategic shock of COVID-19 has removed everything else from the agenda. You've talked about US-China relations, strategic tensions in the Indo-Pacific. Myanmar, the situation there is deeply disturbing. How do you see realistically ASEAN trying to come to terms with these challenges and contribute to stability going forward?
Well, the situation in Myanmar is tragic. I think there's no other way to describe it. The people in Myanmar are hardworking, talented, great people who actually deserve so much more. The problem, however, is that for over 7 decades, that political system has not delivered on letting the people in Myanmar fulfill their great potential. The more proximate problem now is that the two poles of the political system in Myanmar, the military leadership on one hand, the civilian leadership led by Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, clearly that nexus broke down, and in turn, whatever has led to this current situation where you've got a coup and the civilian leadership has been arrested. What ASEAN wants most of all, number one, stop the violence. Number two, have honest, direct dialogue, negotiation, communications between the military leadership and the National League for Democracy. And that needs to occur, not because external parties say so, but because the leaders within Myanmar agree to do so. So what ASEAN is trying to do is to be supportive, to provide a conducive environment, a safe environment, if you like, in which these discussions and negotiations can go on. I do not believe in megaphone diplomacy. Similarly, on sanctions, we also have to be very careful that COVID-19 has already inflicted a grievous blow to the economy of Myanmar before this recent events. And the worst thing which we could do would be to add on to the burden onto the ordinary citizens of Myanmar. So it's a very delicate moment, and we need to be very careful. And again, I would share with you my medical instinct is first, do no harm. Second, make the right diagnosis, and then carefully embark on hopefully the road to recovery. It's going to be a long road. I will not raise false hopes, but it's going to be a long road. And the other point and final point I will make on this, it's not only ASEAN, but also the role of its immediate neighbors, which are obviously India and China. They too have strategic interests at stake, and they too, I believe, can also play a quiet, constructive, and helpful role behind the scenes.